more than half an hour late. My name's Roger and I'm from the Bristol Radical History Group. And George and Sylvia, other members of them, have actually been very helpful in getting us to come over here to do some talks this week, has already been mentioned. I was asked 2 weeks ago maybe to be a moderator. I wasn't quite sure what a moderator was, because we don't really have them in England, and some people have accused me of being somewhat less than moderate. I apologise if I'm less than moderate today. I feel very moderate, I'd say that. So, anyway, just to let you know very quickly why I know about Midnight Notes, and I guess I've been asked to moderate on this panel because we're something to do with history. As the theme for this is Midnight Notes history and its central themes. I suspect that's why I might be here. I came across Midnight Notes in the 80s when I was in what I would argue is a revolutionary organisation called Class War, which one of the books. Sorry, comrade. And one of the books we came across in, I think probably the mid-80s was The Strange Victories. I think it's connected to Midnight Notes. I'd never heard of them before that. I certainly hadn't heard of Zero Work or the other background. So, but certainly that book, Strange Victories, was quite influential at the time. There seemed to be a lack of writing from that perspective about the anti-nuclear movement. So it was influential. And since then I've kept my eye on things and come across a lot of other interesting things, including autonomy media. And eventually, a few years ago, we were very happy through our contacts with the Zapatistas, which led us to some US academics to bring Peter and George and Sylvia and Massive and other people over to England. So that's my background. Oh, and I'm an aerospace engineer, by the way. So, right, what we're going to do is we're going to give each... You know that? Everyone else said what they did. So. I'm an aerospace engineer, so we'll chat about climate change later. Well, what we're going to do is each speaker's going to have about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have some discussion. So we try and divide the session in half. So I will try and be less than moderate if you go on too long. So
those microphones work. Those mics work.
Does this mic work? Yes.
Yeah.
I will keep it a little distance here. If it's a little echoey. Malav, thank you. Malav is control some technology here. My name is Monty Neill. I live in Boston. I'm a parent, a grandparent. I lived in Boston many years. In New England, I grew up in Maine. I'm a co-founder of Midnight Notes. And I was a hippie before I got involved in politics. Some of the gray hairs may remember hippies, and I unashamedly was one. And it was through that and sort of a cultural approach that I first got involved in politics. And I got involved in anti-war work, lived in DC at some of the height of the anti-war movement activities in the late 1960s. Black liberation support work, new leftism, and exploring a whole variety of political perspectives from anarchism to Stalinism, really. I'm not horribly satisfied. I had been in and out of college mostly to do activism. I ended up back in college in northern New Hampshire, a place called Franconia College, which I went to in large part because I could do what I wanted to do instead of being told incessantly. And teaching there was Peter Linebaugh at the time, and I read Capital for the first time with Peter. And I also began to explore kinds of political perspectives that I had certainly no idea existed up until then, from the Facing Reality and the folks out of Detroit, the Italian autonomous political thinking, Tronti and other folks. And we were, Peter and I, involved in prison support work at the time. It was my job, but it was Peter's part of what Peter was doing. He was then working on the material that became the London Hanged. And through them, I began to know of some of the other folks. And Zero Work didn't come out till a year or so later. And so I remember reading and talking about that extensively. And then there was a job opening up at this little Franconia college. And we were lucky to, as part of attracting Sylvia, to take that job. So she came up and actually became a housemate with myself and Shelley and our son Damien. And it's a big old farmhouse. And George would come up and visit. And so I began to get to know them, and that led to really much more rereading and thinking and talking much more deeply around wages for housework and a number of the other materials. And so by that point, you know, the leftism that I had first started with in its various brands had to my mind, just simply didn't explain enough about the world. It didn't help me understand it well enough. It didn't fit with what I thought I knew about the world. It didn't help me think about what I needed to do. So this was, sort of filling an intellectual space with me. Franconia collapsed. So he went back to New York. I ended up in Boston. And at one point I said, I gotta take this stuff from zero work and what I know and understand. So I went down to visit George, and we started talking. And Hans, also known as PM, was at the time living in New York in Sylvia's apartment. And then we reached out to John and a few other folks, but we are still together here doing this work. And we started a series of projects. We hadn't yet given it a name. But we started a series of projects. And one of them involved work, particularly through Hans, because he'd been involved in the anti-nuclear movements in Europe. And we were somewhat involved with them as they were emerging in New England, for example. Some of the others I was, George was. And 3 Mile Island happened, so we concentrated on analyzing that movement in the light of 3 Mile Island, and that produced our first product 30 years ago, Strange Victories. And it was because one of the things that it did was it was a class composition analysis. It was rooted in some thinking of Marxism, but of particular conceptions of class that were not common in the left, certainly in the United States. It was tied to an analysis of existing movements. We were trying to understand how those movements came into being, their relationship to other sectors of class, to capital, how the struggles were being shaped in these contexts and emerging. And in fact, while some people in the movement, of course, were very unhappy with this production, others appreciated it greatly and used it. And so it was the first example of concrete work we did, analyses that circulated within the movements we were talking about. And we've, I think, tried to do that over the years. So what I'm going to do now is really some very quick touch on a few things because we're talking 30 years. And last spring I spent a lot of time rereading stuff, 30 years of material, and it took me quite a while to do it. And I couldn't pretend to do much in another 6 minutes or whatever here. Major projects over time, such as the work energy crisis and the apocalypse. And one of the things we've done that I think is very important is there were periods when many of us have been physically together. Peter, by the way, joined us soon after, also very early on, and from the Zero Work Group, and has remained with us. Certainly an active part of our work for many years. But we have been, analyzing historical struggles. We have been trying to do a class composition analysis. And so in the work energy crisis, we've tried to understand the so-called energy crisis of the 1970s and early 80s as a question of capitalist crisis, not as a question of quote-unquote energy as nature necessarily, but of class struggle. And we've been trying to understand, and what you might call it a hypothesis, that the development of capitalism is first and foremost a question of class struggle, and try to understand working class struggle against the capitalist system, and how that has, though we have not obviously got rid of capitalism, it has been the primary force behind capitalist development and capitalist crises. And that's a question we had to return to recently to ask ourselves whether that was still true, whether that analysis could in fact illuminate the current crisis. But we were doing that work a lot and trying to understand the world from that. So we touched on many things in this period in our writings. I mentioned historical analyses, law and prisons, race issues, gender issues, how they're emerging in particular contexts, and through that often very sharply worded, I think, critique of the left in the United States. Frequently as even the left of capitalism, a point that was brought up in the names, the recent piece that circulated to many of us. Team Colors piece, thank you very much. So these issues, these themes have been with us, but starting in 79, 80, there were a whole series of crises. There was the arrests in Italy, there were many crises in the United States, and many personal crises of job loss, of unemployment, of political repression that were affecting us directly and the milieu we were moving in. And one of the consequences of that was a lot of us were in motion. George and Sylvia were in Africa. The people we had been working with at the start of Midnight Notes were physically dispersed, which also meant often fewer conversations. And I think a slowdown in our production rate. It's never been vast, but it's slowed down. The first stage of slowing down, one might say.